Thank you, Laura. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Friends, these days, I just cannot help but think of the famous quote from The Tale of Two Cities, which starts the book by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We see around us so much cruelty, death, wars, and selfish individuals. But at the same time, we also see and hear voices of love, care, and we just saw the amazing achievement of Artemis 2, which splashed down in the beaches of San Diego yesterday. It is pretty clear that we see this as a metaphor for the battle between the lower and higher self. It continues throughout the ages. It is indeed the battle of Kurukshetra, so beautifully expressed in William Corn Judge's preface to his rendition of the verses of the Bhagavad Gita. Here, the battle of Kurukshetra takes place between two sets of cousins, the Kurus or the Kauravas and the Pandavas. In today's time, we could compare it with the Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or the Harry Potter series. The struggle between the lower and the higher forces in all of us. We shall try to understand this battle in the words of the founders of the Theosophical movement, along with other voices. And we hope to understand and apply how we as students of Theosophy and others can aspire to gravitate towards what is noble, higher, and true, while we have a general idea of the impediments along the way. Now, H.P. Blavatsky wrote a two-part article in the Lucifer magazine in 1890 titled Psychic and Noetic Action, illustrating this struggle between us as the lower self, which she calls psychic, and the higher ego, which she calls noetic. Now, these articles, a lot of articles from Lucifer and other magazines have been collected together in the Theosophical Articles in 2 volumes. Now, she starts the article talking about how psychologists, or physiopsychologists as they were called, using the analytical method to try to understand consciousness and thought processes in humans. The analytical method, using chemistry as an example, breaks down, say, compounds to their simplest forms, namely elements. One could use similar techniques in trying to understand consciousness and say that, as H.P. Blavatsky says, for most of them, the physiopsychologists, the personal idea of free agency is an error, an illusion. Free agency is another way of talking about free will. She talks about a professor of physiology, Mr. Herzen, stating that the claim of free will is an absurdity in man. H.P. Blavatsky says that this is a fallacy in this method because in the process of reducing their calculations to the simplest form, there is a great possibility of not observing the same properties that one would see in the original material. For example, she gives the example of water. When it is broken down, you get the 2 gases, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, does one negate the properties of water? just because you do not observe them in the two gases, hydrogen and oxygen. She states that just because you cannot observe certain behaviors with the analytical approach, it doesn't mean that it isn't there. There is motion everywhere, but the scientists are only able to observe molecular motion. And she states there are other kinds of motions that cannot be observed with the techniques they use. And then she says from page 11 of the article, molecular motion is the lowest and most material of its finite manifestations, while the free will of man belongs to quite a different plane from the physical. H.P. Blavatsky adds that the occultist talks about psychic individuality, which he calls manasic or noetic. And she defines it as the self-determining power which enables man to override circumstances. So here we see the dual nature in man. And then she adds on page 12 to 13 of Psychic Noëtic Action, place half a dozen animals of the same species under the same circumstances, and their actions, while not identical, will be closely similar. Now, place half a dozen humans under the same circumstances, and their actions will be as different as their characters. That is their psychic individuality. At the same time that H.P. Blavatsky talks about many scientists, psychologists throwing the baby with the bath water, she does mention the exceptions. She talks about Professor George T. Ladd, an American philosopher, educator, and psychologist of the 19th century, who states on page 13, the phenomena of human consciousness must be regarded as activities of some other form of real being than the moving molecules of the brain. Bingo! He echoes exactly what H.P. Blavatsky stated earlier. Then she quotes from the Elements of Physiological Psychology, a book that was written by Professor Ladd, page 616. And it's on page 17 of the collection of articles on psychic and noetic action. And he says, the history of each individual's experiences is such as requires the assumption that a real unit being, a mind, is undergoing a process of development in relation to the changing condition or evolution of the brain, and yet in accordance with the nature and laws of its own. H.P. Blavatsky concurs, but adds that the unit being doesn't create anything. It creates nothing. No question of creation, but guidance. Let us jump from the 19th century ideas about the mind to our present time. What do some psychologists say today? We will focus on just one. It's very intriguing to see what one psychologist of the 21st century has concluded about the workings of the brain today. I just want to add here that they are just talking about the brain. They don't even mention mind. Ezra Klein, a reporter from the New York Times, interviews Michael Pollan about the experiments he had to conduct under the guidance of Russell Herbert, a psychologist. Michael Pollan is an author, journalist, and activist. I would add that he is someone who is interested in the relationship between anthropos and pan, man and nature, and he focuses on food gathering. He's written a lot of books, and I shall mention a few: The Botany of Desire, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and Cooked. Russell Herbert, the psychologist, gives him a beeper to record his thoughts every time the beeper beeps. And it does so about 5 or 6 times a day. Russell asks him questions about his thoughts. Were they in the form of complete sentences, images, or thought fragments? Michael feels that they could be images, in fact, emojis, and sometimes in the form of a sentence or a part of a sentence. It could even be triggered by certain smells around him. The net result of this experiment made him realize that his thoughts were nothing profound, pretty banal, but they bounced all over and were unusual. The experiment led him to write a book about his experiences, and he concludes that his thoughts get weirder and weirder. In other words, the only thing this present day experiment helped was in understanding the randomness and the darting of the thoughts, moving from one idea to another. Now, the ancients had already seen this in the stages of meditation, and Patanjali, in his yoga aphorisms, talks about the modifications of the mind. And like I said earlier, the word mind is not used in these studies because it is concluded that the brain is generating all the thoughts. Could I have the next slide, please? She ends the first section by quoting from the Kathopanishad. The senses are the horses. Body is the chariot. Mind, kama manas, is the reins, and intellect or free will is the charioteer. She surmises that is more wisdom in the writings in the ancient Upanishads compared to what the scientists have been recording. I would add that in the preface to Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms by William Q. Judge, we hear more about the will. Talking about the verses of Patanjali, William Q. Judge states in the preface, Roman numeral 8 to 9, Roman numeral 13 to 14. These propositions imply that the will is not wholly dependent on the mind, but is separable from it. And further, that knowledge exists as an abstraction. The will and mind are only servants for the soul's use. When William Kwanjaj uses the word soul, I would translate it to the higher mind. So, the will and mind are only servants for the soul's use, but so long as we are wrapped up in material life and do not admit that the real knower and only experiencer is the soul, just so long do these servants remain usurpers of the soul's sovereignty. Hence, it is stated in old Hindu works that the soul is the friend of small self and also its enemy, and that a man should rise the small self by the higher self. Again, this is just talking about the constant struggle between the lower and the higher self, in which the illusions of matter always wage war against the soul, tending ever to draw downward the inner principles, which, lying midway between the upper and the lower, are capable of reaching either salvation or damnation. These are critical ideas that will be echoed by something H.P. Blavatsky says later. In the second part of this article, H.P. Blavatsky also states that science doesn't know the difference between psychic and noetic mental functions, because they reject the higher noetic character of the mind principle and confuse even the psychic for the psychological. She states that students of Theosophy realize that Manas is dual, and moreover, every atom has its intelligence, and every cell endowed with consciousness/memory. And the seat of memory is throughout the human body. So she states on pages 19 to 20, to locate this memory or consciousness in the physical brain is to limit and dwarf the universal mind and its countless rays, the Manasaputra, which inform every rational mortal. She therefore says that the immortal entity is the divine mind or nous, and its pale reflection is what we call mind and intellect in man. The all-conscious higher self incarnates periodically, while the lower self acts on the plane of illusion or maya, imagining it is the real I, and falls into the heresy of separateness. Could I have the next slide, please? She says, the higher ego cannot act directly on the body, as its consciousness belongs to quite another plane and planes of ideation. The lower self does, and its action and behavior depend on its free will and choice as to whether it will gravitate more towards its parent, Father in heaven, or the animal which it informs, the man of flesh. This is the crux of this whole article. Which way will we go? And then she said again on page 21 of Psychic and Noetic Action, it is only the higher forms of sense thought, the superconscious mental experiences, that can correlate with the cerebral and cardiac centers. The memories of physical and selfish or personal deeds, on the other hand, together with the mental experiences of a terrestrial nature and of earthly biological functions, can of necessity only be correlated with the molecular constitution of various karmic, KAMIC, organs, and the dynamical associations of the elements of the nervous systems in each particular organ. Which brings us back to the statement made earlier that every organ in our body has its own memory. Could I have the next slide, please? And she elaborates. Every human organ and each cell in the latter has a keyboard of its own, like that of a piano, only that it registers and emits sensations instead of sounds. Each key contains the potentiality for good or bad, or producing harmony or disharmony. This depends on the impulse given and the combinations produced in the force of the touch of the artist at work. A double-faced unity indeed. A different way of saying what William Conchard says in the preface reading from the Yoga Aphorisms of Patanjali. So in conclusion, we need to understand the sacredness of the body, which is like a piano, which is the temple of the Holy Grail, and shows so much potential to reach the stars. It is up to each one of us while on this earth and in this fourth globe, the most material, to work, self-induced and self-devised, to try to connect constantly with the noetic higher part of us. Thank you.